Hi, Stu. Thanks for joining us. So last week we released our latest trait report, which was lactate utilisation for energy. So looking at the way that through respiration, lactate is recycled and uptaken in the interest of energy production. So looking at it very much from a performance endurance point of view. So really exciting to get the latest report out. We obviously had a bit of a break over summer, so this is our first one of the autumn, and we've got a few more coming down the line as well. But I thought it would be a good opportunity just to talk to you about the topic quite generally. You know, I do a lot of exercise myself. I've obviously been working for FitnessGenes for a number of years, but this topic about energy systems and energy production has always been one that I've struggled to kind of get my head around. So I'm hoping you're going to be able to shine a little bit of a light on it and sort of talk about it in the context of our latest report, which is lactate utilisation. So what is lactate and how is it used within the energy production systems? So hopefully that's all okay with you.
Sure, I'll try my best.
Right, excellent. So I guess first of all, what are the type of systems that we're looking at in terms of energy production and how do they work?
Cool, thank you. I think you touched on it quite well. I think there's sort of three components to draw on here. The first is the description, which is what is classically known as the aerobic and anaerobic systems, and I think the people feel their independence and the way biology sort of is performed and the way cells respond to the environment. That's not necessarily the case. So we're going to touch on these different systems and how they kind of respond to the demands of the muscle during exercise. The second one is lactate, again classically thought to be a byproduct of exercise that has then a negative impact on performance, and that's just not true. And then the third point will be then around the trait that we look at, which is a variant in the transport that impacts the transport of lactate in and out of cells. So we just understand how that then can impact your performance and what we can do about it ultimately, which is pretty much the end game of what we're doing. So first, energy system. So I guess, where does energy come from? So we have our 4 macronutrients, of course. So carbohydrates, fats, protein. And do you know what the fourth one is?
It's alcohol. Yeah.
It's alcohol, yes.
I read your preparation sheet ahead of the call, so I was aware it was alcohol. Yes.
Yeah, fantastic. That's good. You would have known that anyway. So obviously we ingest these energy forms, but we do not use these directly. So you don't, in the same way you would put alcohol into one of those little burners you had in a lab and set fire to it. You don't directly utilize those macros with energy. You use the energy that's stored in these molecules and fix it in a bond in a molecule called ATP. So I'm sure you've probably heard about ATP a lot, known as the energy currency of the cell, adenosine triphosphate. Triphosphate has 3 phosphates attached to it. 2 of those phosphates are held within high energy bonds. So when you break that phosphate, you release energy, and they're the currencies that move around the cell, and that molecule releases energy to drive the majority of the cellular reactions that happen, including the contraction of skeletal muscle that occurs during exercise.
So when we're talking about energy systems, we're looking at the ways in which ATP is generated.
Precisely, yes. So let's now draw this to exercise. So the ATP is the currency for energy. We store it in our muscles. So when we initiate exercise, we will start using ATP. So quick sort of question to you: how much in terms of seconds of exercise? Now you can think about this as strenuous exercise versus light exercise, but how much ATP reserve do you think we have in our muscles in terms of seconds before it's run out?
So storage of ATP that you
exactly,
can draw upon. I don't know, probably 30 seconds.
So for strenuous exercise, it's 2 seconds before it's all used up.
2 seconds.
2 seconds, depending on training status and everything else. And then for lighter exercise, we'll have used it up at least by, I think, 10 to 15 seconds. So not a lot is a short answer.
Yeah, that seems like not a lot at all. That seems like some quite poor adaptation. And
intelligent design. Here we go.
Yeah. So if the storage of ATP is so low, then I assume there needs to be a continuous sort of production of ATP to fuel the exercise.
Exactly, yeah. So, and this goes back to the sort of the anaerobic and aerobic energy systems that then are producing ATP. So there's two types. So the anaerobic, which is substrate level, also called, and the aerobic, which is oxidative level, uses oxygen. The substrate level produces less ATP, but is a lot more, it's quicker, it's more responsive. And there's two types of this. The first one is the phosphocreatine system. So as it suggests, you've got creatine with a phosphate on. When you're not exercising, you'll get creatine molecules that have this phosphate moiety attached to it. Once you start to use ATP in the cell, the ATP, triphosphate, is converted to ADP, diphosphate. The enzyme that catalyzes the attachment of creatine's phosphate to ADP to create more ATP is very sensitive to the levels of ATP and ADP in the cell. So it responds incredibly quickly within the first few seconds. So you've got this phosphocreatine that can add or donate its phosphate to ADP to create more ATP. Happens very quickly. Unfortunately, that only then lasts for 15 seconds, and that system's spent as well. So this is very much associated with high intensity exercise.
I was going to say, so like sprint work, weightlifting.
Yes. Exactly, and we'll talk about it a bit later when what we can do about stuff. But creatine is obviously a supplement that's used for the reasons of its use in energy systems and other systems too. The second one is probably classically known as aerobic respiratory, so the aerobic energy generation, or anaerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic, and this is where you start to break down glycogen to form lactate and also hydrogen ion. So in the very early moments of exercise, the first thing that happens is you get a raise of adrenaline and a raise of increased calcium in the cell because of the muscle contractions. Your body responds imminently to that and drives the creatine phosphatase enzyme, which drives phosphocreatine adaptation to drive more ATP. Then you start to get an increase in ADP, and this drives the modification of glycogen, which is stored glucose, to be put through the anaerobic glycolysis pathway. And this produces our lactate molecule and hydrogen molecule that we'll talk about in a bit more detail with our trait in a minute.
So this is still in the absence of oxygen at this point. So we're still talking about quite high intensity forms of exercise.
Well, and I think that this, again, classically how they're defined, you do not need oxygen to use anaerobic glycolysis by definition. However, anaerobic glycolysis will exist whilst there's oxygen available. So I think this is one of the misconceptions, that you've kind of got one or the other. Obviously there's a flux between the two, but during intensive exercise you are still also performing what is oxidative phosphorylation, the aerobic generation of ATP, which generates a lot more ATP molecules per molecule of glycogen. A molecule of glucose, sorry. So they will happen in tandem. So I think, again, when trained individuals, it's about sort of 30 to a minute of high intensity exercise. 50% of the ATP at that stage is generated by oxidative phosphorylation. So you kind of have this very early phosphocreatine process, which generates ATP very quickly. Then you have the anaerobic glycolysis that produces, I think it's 2 ATP, if I remember correctly, from my biochemistry undergrad, which was many years ago, but also this lactate molecule and the hydrogen ion. And then you use glucose, and at lower states as well, you use fatty acids that then get driven down. The oxidative processes, which requires oxygen, happens in the mitochondria. You go through something called the Krebs cycle, or TCA cycle, the citric acid cycle, then the electron transport chain, where you generate lots more molecules of ATP. But that is not as reactive. So again, thinking about evolved systems, it's the difference between traveling long distances over the savannah. We always go back to the savannah, don't we? It's quite the glib place to put ourselves. Or when you're sprinting and getting out of a situation to save your life, where you're probably going to be using more of the phosphocreatine systems and the anaerobic glycolysis systems.
Okay, I feel like I'm getting there. So I mean, so you touched on sort of lactate and hydrogen ions being kind of I guess kind of like the byproduct. Would that be correct in terms of the anaerobic respiration?
Exactly. So again, we've all probably been to the gym, and to be honest, I've done this myself, where you lift some weights and you talk about the lactic acid burn, which is it's a bit of a misnomer. Lactate is so when you have anaerobic glycolysis, you still have a lot of stored energy in the molecule at the end, because normally you have a process where you create pyruvate at the end of glycolysis, and then this feeds through the other energy systems, the oxidative systems that produce many more ATPs. So you've got a molecule at the end of it, it's still full of energetic potential, which is lactate. So it's not a negative byproduct, and it's not creating an acid of lactic acid. It is actually just another molecule that can be reused for energy, and that's why its transport's very important too. What you also have produced, though, are hydrogen ions. Now, you may have heard of a process called acidosis. So the more, and this is why you can't continue to do anaerobic glycolysis for so long. So it's after about 30 to 60 seconds, you have too much acidosis in the muscle, not because of lactate per se, but because of the hydrogen ions, which means the muscle contractions can cease. You cease to be able to have the action potentials and drive the muscle contractions that enable you to move quickly. And you've all probably felt this when you've done sprint training and your legs just feel like absolute jelly at the end of it. So it's not the lactate. The lactate has been wrongly blamed in the past. It's the hydrogen ions that come with the process of generating lactate, and those few ATP during anaerobic glycolysis that cause that burn.
Okay, so it's the hydrogen ions that are causing the fatigue within the muscle.
There's many other components around that, but in that process, the lactate is just a molecule that generally can be used for other energy purposes. Of course, you can have too much lactate in the blood. You cannot be recycling it through the oxidative pathways enough, which has a negative consequence. But it doesn't impact the muscle contraction itself. It is the hydrogen ions that impact the muscle contraction.
Okay, so what is the use of the lactate then? You mentioned that it's used within other energy systems.
Sure.
So how is it repurposed?
So there's something that's coined, I think, a few decades ago now, which is the lactate shuttle hypothesis. So you're going to get tissues, and for example, the more glycolytic muscles, the faster twitch muscles, are more likely to produce lactate. The tissues that are more oxidative actually can use lactate to then put into what is the oxidative phosphorylation process, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain to produce lots more ATP. So this can get fed back into oxidative processes and produce lots of ATP. So it's still another energy currency in a similar way to glucose would be. So that can be then moved to different cells. Now, first thing, so all cells will have an oxidative process. So when you produce lactate, say in a fast twitch muscle fiber, that then can get fed into the oxidative process and generate ATP once the muscle's at rest again, replenish the phosphocreatine, replenish the ATP reserves too. But also it can get shuttled around the body. It can be sent to other muscle cells, so it actually can be shuttled between different muscle fibers, and also it can get sent to the liver where it's reprocessed, glycogen can be formed, and there's other sort of energy capture processes that can then get you back in line for another explosive exercise bout, so to speak. Now, this transport is very important, and this leads on to our trait, because the variants we're looking at in this trait were associated with lactate transport. So the mutations we're looking at in MCT1, and this moves lactate and hydrogen ions into cells. So this will be moving it back into liver, moving it and shuttling it over to other muscle cell fibers, but also as well potentially into the mitochondria where it can be reused as energy. So if you have increased transport, you are utilizing lactate more efficiently as an energy source. If you have lower transport, you are not utilizing it as well as an energy source. So as can be expected, people with better transport are, or should I say the variance that is associated with better transport is overrepresented in individuals who are elite athletes, particularly endurance athletes.
So that was my personal result, was increased lactate clearance. So I think about 18% of our members fell within that group.
Yes.
So as I understood it, it's increased expression of kind of the proteins involved in that transportation process, which allows for better utilization of lactate as a source of energy. So yeah, so I guess within a sort of, for example, I'm going for a run this evening. So how, and sort of where we've talked about around the process, but speaking specifically about my improved lactate clearance, how is that going to benefit me this evening? And is there anything else that I could do sort of on top of my result to actually improve it further?
Cool. Yeah, no, there's two components to that. The first one is the one thing about the MCT transporter as well. It doesn't just transport lactate, also transports the hydrogen ions that cause the acidosis. So the hydrogen ions are also reused as well within a lot of the processes. So first things first, you are going to have a reduction in prolonged acidosis, particularly as we talked about this period after exercise where you're clearing your lactate, you're clearing your hydrogen ions. You will be able to recover quicker from those intensive bouts of exercise. So individual, say individual, like, so you are a fast clearer, I'm actually the opposite. I'm a slower clearer. I would look to have longer rest times between sprint training, for example. So when my Garmin watch tells me do these sprints and have the 5 minutes, actually a 6-7 minute rest might be better for me if I'm then to perform at my maximal performance in the next bout within the circuit. Interesting point though, so not to, just so my ego isn't too bruised on this, actually when you think about the increased lactate and increased hydrogen ions, when you have an increased concentration within the cell, it actually drives hypertrophic pathways. So we've heard about something called metabolic stress, where you have, but because all these molecules are actually signaling molecules, when you have build up of certain metabolites, the body goes, okay, well, we've got this increased need for muscle fibers. So actually what you have is a bigger hypertrophic signal when you are clearing it slower. So again, lower clearance is linked to more power properties, as higher clearance is, as you stated, to more endurance properties. But just to concentrate, because this trait is more on the within the endurance aim. So I guess when you're starting to think about it, so with I think the key take homes are really with the slower clearance, really where you can make the difference, and actually that seems to be the broader population within our community. So obviously there's VO2 max training, which is something that is utilised. We've got a trait on VO2 max training, and that's something we can probably touch on in another podcast, so I won't go into detail with that. As just described, longer rest times, because you're going to suffer more from post-exercise or post-set, if you're talking about hypertrophy, acidosis. You might want to give a bit more time for your muscle to recover so the contractions aren't interfered with. We've talked about creatine. With phosphocreatine. Creatine is a very popular supplement. Creatine supplementation has been shown to raise phosphocreatine levels by 10 to 15% higher. So in that initial phase where you initiate exercise, it can give you increased ATP production properties because of that increased levels of phosphocreatine. Carbohydrate loading is really important as well, and this is more for probably the longer term endurance athletics. Now again, we can, because there's the recreational runner versus the elite athlete. The elite athlete, carbohydrate loading is very important. The fact that there's actually some studies that show if you just have carbohydrate in the mouth, actually improves exercise performance, and because of the way you sense carbohydrate and the body thinks you've got carbohydrate coming, and it improves the ergonomic effects of muscle, which is kind of an interesting sort of border sort of psychosomatic impact of carbohydrate. But again,
so what does that involve? Does that involve running with, I don't know, a sandwich stuck between your teeth?
I'd probably think maybe like a jelly bean or something in your mouth or something. Okay. So I know you have these
sort of simple sugar.
Yeah, maybe just the dextrose tablet. I can't quite remember what they used in the studies, but during running you have these jelly beans which have electrolytes and sugar in, pop one, let it dissolve, and that has an impact. Borderline impact, not borderline, so small impact, but it still has an impact. But again, there's always kind of, when you start talking about sort of high fat diets, carbohydrate loading, we are aware that many of our members also are looking to get fit but also lose weight as well. So these are things that need to be done within the context of just maintaining a healthy diet. Now the second point, and I think it's more interesting, is getting rid of the acidosis. So the acidosis, as we described, is what impacts the muscle contractions. So lots of studies done. First, the oral alkalizers, such as bicarbonate, you get in a lot of pre-workouts. A significant determinant of buffering within the muscle as well is carnosine, and actually it's beta-alanine supplementation that actually has been shown to raise carnosine levels and helps with the acidosis and buffering. So beta-alanine is a reasonably common pre-workout as well. And then there's the more broad, so there's some interesting examples of where they've looked at, I think blueberry powder is a new one that's been shown to help lactate processing and how it's utilised within the cell. There's part of the oxidative phosphorylation process is the production of oxygen-free radicals as well, and how antioxidants impact this whole process. Now going back to what we talked about in terms of these metabolites being signaling molecules that tell your body, okay, we've had a significant exercise event. That sounds like my yearly run, but you know, a significant exercise event, and then the muscle adapts. So if you and the oxygen-free radicals generated are one of those signaling molecules. So people think of these free radicals as always being bad. Actually, no, it's a way of the body signaling, okay, a process has occurred. Let's adapt the muscle, create more mitochondria, you know, make the muscle more adapted to endurance, for example. And actually certain antioxidants, I think they've shown this with high dose vitamin C, actually can sort of limit the muscular adaptations to particular exercise. So having tons of antioxidants may not necessarily be a good thing. But
I've certainly seen that recommendation within our reports about having vitamin C around, or the timing of vitamin C.
Yes, exactly, precisely. So the key fundamentals are rest periods, the amount of carbohydrate and creatine you have in the body, and then mitigating acidosis. So with the bicarbonates and the beta-alanines, they're kind of the key sort of direct actions. Then there's, you know, rolling muscle recovery, how you taper down or your exercise, and there'll be very exercise specific recommendations, but sort of the broad recommendations around what I've just described.
Great. Okay, so just as a bit of a summary then, I know we've kind of covered a lot, but in terms of the report that we've put out this week, for people who have increased lactate clearance, of which, as I said, about 18% of our members do, that carries endurance performance benefits because you're able to remove the hydrogen ions from working muscles at a more efficient rate, which prolongs or delays, fatigue and muscle soreness, but also it upcycles the lactate so that it can be used within other energy systems, which leads to greater ATP production, and that has carryover benefits for endurance performance as well. Would you say that's kind of an accurate summary?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it truncates the acidosis for sure, as you're utilising those hydrogen ions more quickly.
Well, it's always reassuring to know that I've understood the reports that we're putting out.
Yeah. And it's reassuring to know I'm talking sense as well.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll leave it at that because I think we've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure there's more offshoots that we can cover in future recordings as well. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, Stu. And what's coming up next in terms of the release?
I think in terms of podcast releases, I think there's a couple on the horizon. I'm going to be looking at there's been an interesting paper out recently about how aging, or should I say longevity, is plateauing. So we have all these longevity gurus talking about how we're going to live forever, and that is obviously not going to be the case, and some of the reasons why that. And the other one as well is we keep getting asked about is methylation. There's lots of companies selling methylation tests. What does that mean? How relevant is it to me? So yeah, I think there in terms of the podcasts. In terms of trait releases, were you actually looking at
and trait releases as well? Yes, I'm interesting, but trait releases as well are always good.
Yeah, so the women's health one is ready to go. So probably when this podcast comes out, the women's health traits will be there. testosterone we're looking at next, and this will be put into the muscle build categories as well as general hormonal categories. Yeah, lots to carry on with.
Great. Well, it sounds like you've got plenty to get on with, so I'll let you get back to the cricket, and
Sure.
I'll see you back here for next time.
Cheers, Alex. Take care.
Thanks, Stu. Bye.